Good morning. What do you want your children and grandchildren to know and remember about you? Several years ago, my brother decided he wanted my father to write his biography, a story of his life. He determined that one day grandchildren who didn't know him would like to know something about his life, about how he grew up. So he left about a year before he died a volume about his life, and I still have three or four copies today, and I will hand those down to my grandchildren. I found out things about him I didn't really know either. Because of that, I've also done the same thing. In fact, I bought a book that would allow me to be guided through the process so that one day my grandchildren or great grandchildren who will never know who I am will be able to know something about me. That's an important idea because the generational foundations provide a basis for reality and for the family. When you get to the nation of Israel, they'll connect themselves with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It will become a generational foundation tenet of their faith. So when we come to the end of Jacob's life, he carries on this tradition, and so today, we like to visit Jacob's family in the twilight of his life. The first thing we come to is Jacob meeting his grandsons, the sons of Joseph, who he has never met. It must have been something for Jacob to find his long-lost son, but then discover that he had two grandchildren through whom one day we're going to make things clearer. And so as we come to Genesis chapter 48, Jacob finally meets his grandsons. It says, your two sons born to you in Egypt before I came to you here will be reckoned as mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Simeon are mine. Now, what do you think the significance of that statement is? I think it's interesting because now these two sons will become like the sons of Jacob himself. And in fact, in history, Joseph will not have a tribe. It says Israel's eyes were failing because of old age, and he could hardly see. So Joseph brought his two sons close to him, and his father kissed them and embraced them. Go back to a time when Isaac was laying on his own deathbed. He too could not see well, and he would be easily deceived by his son Jacob. It must have been reminiscent for Jacob at that moment, and so the sons were brought to him so he could bless them. The blessing was given with words and gestures. He would place his hands on the children and give them a blessing. The right hand belonged to the one who had supremacy, the left hand to the one who did not. But something strange happened. It said that Israel reached out his right hand and put it on the wrong head, as though he were younger and crossing his arms. It says that he reached his right hand and put it out on Ephraim's head, though he was younger, and crossing his arms to put his left hand on Manasseh was the firstborn. It's interesting that he does that. He blesses these two children, but backwards. The oldest becomes the youngest, and the youngest becomes the oldest, but there's a reason behind this. But why do you think Jacob did it? We know about Joseph's reaction to this because it's found in Genesis 48:17 through following. He wasn't happy with his father for doing it. And so he physically took the hands that had been crossed and changed the placement so the right hand was on the firstborn of Manasseh and the left one was on the head of his young child Ephraim. But Jacob knew what he was doing because he tells his son, I know he too will become a people and he will become great. Nevertheless, the younger brother will be greater than he and his descendants. They will become groups of nations. So he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. And only time would prove this to be true. If you look at a map of the 12 tribes of Israel after they've come into the land, after it's been parceled up, you'll see what happened. Manasseh is given a large portion on the east and west bank of the Jordan River, but his brother has much smaller territory. So the land seems to reflect the birth order, but something else seems to be happening that you don't see as well. When you go down in time, Ephraim will become the capital city of the nation of Samaria or northern Israel Je- Jero- after Jeroboam the first steals the 10 northern tribes. They become their own nation. It's the same capital city of the north that will try to be free. Ephraim will become supreme, and Manasseh, you won't hear much about them throughout the years. When you go back to Genesis 27 and the blessing given to Jacob and the blessing that was not received by Esau, you see Isaac discussing the matter with Esau, who is now both angry and disappointed. He says to his older son, I have made him Lord over you. I have made all of your relatives his servants, and I have sustained him. Here it is, history repeating itself, and you see the plan of God doesn't seem to make any linear sense, but it makes great spiritual sense in the long run. But it will become time for the last days of Jacob. Genesis 47 says as time drew near for Israel to die, he called his son Joseph to come to him. He has a request. He asked Joseph to make him a promise. The promise is, if I found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise that you'll show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried. The concept of putting your hand under the thigh has many origins, I suppose. One may be extremely personal. After all, you're putting the human touch in a very sensitive area. If you also think about it, when a hand is under a thigh, the person is sitting on them. He maintains control over that person. So what Jacob is doing is making Joseph responsible for keeping his promise by saying, I have held you captive with this promise. It's always a reminder that when you make a promise, you're under the bondage of keeping it. And then a summary statement in Genesis chapter 47 ends. It says that they indeed settled them to Goshen, and they acquired property there, and they were fruitful and increased greatly in number. Jacob lived for 17 more years until he died at the age of 147 years old. The interesting thing is they were increasing in number, a fact that Exodus chapter 1 brings into stark relief. Or they'll become more numerous than the Egyptians in the land of Egypt, which will cause the bondage, which will inevitably give way to the exodus of Egypt. So when you come to the end, you realize something. Jacob's name means deceiver, and that's how he lived his life. He should have received a lot worse than he got. But he had his share of suffering with the loss of his wife Rachel, the captivity of Joseph, and the potential loss of his son Benjamin. But in the end, he experienced the grace of God. God had given him so many blessings. He allowed him to see his son Joseph again. He had experienced meeting his grandchildren that he never knew. His family was growing, and the promise of God's moving along. It's a reminder that life, even in the worst of times, we can experience God's grace if we'll just remain with him. But then, as the end hastens itself, Jacob does something important. He gives a blessing. It involves reminding people who they are and telling them what they will be. It's something we've lost in today's society. Perhaps it would be best served to resurrect it. We can call our children or grandchildren together and give them a spiritual blessing, ideals to live up to, a promise of goodness if faithful, and something meaningful to hang on to the rest of their lives. I remember that about a month before my father died, I was taking him to the dermatologist appointment like we did about once every 2 weeks. As we were driving, he suddenly said, out of the blue, I don't know what I'd have done had you not been here. That statement has resonated through every day since. As I deal with my own children and grandchildren, I realize I want to be there for them, and I would want them to be there for me. Such is the power of a blessing. So Jacob turns to his son and says, I can tell you what will happen to you in days to come. These are not wishes, but prophecies. As the patriarch who wrestled with God, God now allows him to see the outcome of each of his boys' lives. First comes Reuben. He says to Reuben that You may have the might of the firstborn, but you're turbulent as water, and you will no longer excel. Jacob has not forgotten the incest that Reuben committed with one of his wives. At that moment, his future and the future of his children were sealed. Reuben's family would come to the promised land, but they'd be part of Israel that settled on the east side of the Jordan, and they would be surrounded by enemies and suffer for it. Then he turns his attention to Simeon and Levi. In Genesis 34, Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, is raped by the prince of Shechem. When he wants to buy her for his wife, it's Simeon and Levi that concoct a plan to get revenge. They will demand that all the men of Shechem be circumcised, something that the prince agrees to if that's the price of getting this woman. But while they are in pain, Simeon and Levi lead a raiding party to slaughter the men and steal their wealth. It created a lot of tension for Jacob with the Hittites. A headache he really didn't need at that moment. So now, many years after the event, that seemed like nothing at the time, the chickens had now come home to roost. Jacob turns to Simeon and Levi and denounces their violent natures. For this, they will be scattered in Israel. And indeed, they were. When the people returned to the promised land, Levi had no territory. Rather, the priestly tribe would get small allotments in all the various tribes. And Simeon, the tribe never really seemed to establish itself and was swallowed into the larger Judah over time. Then Jacob turns to Judah, the one who offered his own life for Benjamin. Unlike his brothers, his descendants will do great things. He will be a conqueror who will be powerful. Indeed, the scepter would not depart from Judah. His lineage will provide a blessing beyond belief. One day, out of the lineage of Bethlehem, a baby will be born and be named Jesus. The words given to Judah will be applied to him, and indeed the scepter did not depart, for he is the Son of God. Then we come to Joseph. He is his father's favored son. His character was constant and faithful even amidst the terrible actions against him. He will be blessed above the skies. All of Israel will be blessed. Joseph, as we've seen, played a pivotal role in God's plan. He is forced to Egypt, but then brings his family. The Exodus will begin with his stature, ignored by the future, but through his actions, deliverance and blessing will become. And Joseph's sons' tribes will become predominant feature in the landscape of the Promised Land, towering over others. Great prophets like Elijah and Elisha will come. They will speak against the idolatry that was so easily adopted by those other sons of Jacob. But the rest, there's nothing. All the remaining sons of Jacob get but a single verse. They'll be insignificant in the life of God's people. They were never going to be great, but evil, or passive, but nothing. It says that each would receive the appropriate blessing. The term is an untranslatable set of characters, but it seems to mean that it will fit their character. It was who they were. Jacob knew his sons, and God knew their destinies. But then comes the end of the great patriarch, and Jacob dies. Before he dies, he gives directions for his burial. He requests that he not be buried in Egypt, but be taken back across the Sinai Peninsula and be buried alongside the bones of his father Isaac and his mother Rebekah. He wanted to lie in the same cave at Machpelah that Abraham had bargained for with the Hittites. Here the great man of faith is buried, along with many others. With that he died, and it says he was gathered to his people. It was a time of great emotion. A son who had been lost had been found, who had wept when he saw his brothers, especially Benjamin, who had wept when his father rolled to a stop at Egypt, now throws himself on his father and for a final time wept over him. It's a holy scene. where life and death are fused together. And Joseph directed that the body be embalmed. Egyptian embalming was quite a feat. It was something that others did not do. And we're aware more of the mummification process of the Egyptians today because of archaeological discoveries. The skin was removed and the body was dried and anointed with spices and preservatives. Some of the organs were removed, and each step was laborious and time-consuming. Finally, in the end, the body was wrapped tightly in linen, where it would be so well preserved that we've been able to examine them medically centuries later. It took 40 days for the process to be completed. Jacob got the burial fit for a king. In Genesis 50 and verse 7, we witnessed the funeral procession that was like no other. Common shepherds and Egyptian territories made. In Genesis 50 verse 7, we witness a funeral procession like no other. Common shepherds and Egyptian dignitaries made a slow, somber journey from Egypt to an obscure Canaanite cave. It says much about the respect that Joseph commanded that the highest officials in the kingdom made this trip. They go to Mamre, a grove of trees between Hebron and Bethlehem. 20 miles to the north was a settlement that would one day become Jerusalem, the city of kings. The Canaanites watched the spectacle and marveled. The wailing pierced the gentle breezes. 7 days they wailed, and as the Canaanites tossed grain at the threshing floor, they realized this must be a great man who had died, since it was a solemn Egyptian ceremony. The end of Jacob's life comes as does all men. He is buried in a grave bought by Abraham from Ephron the Hittite. Jacob told Pharaoh when he first met him, "I have come here to live for a little while." He was only a sojourner in Egypt, and one day wanted to return to the land of promise. The Egyptian writer reflects on this and gave it greater depth of meaning. He says in his rundown of the men and women of faith, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They didn't receive the thing promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. He says we all live by faith as pilgrims in a world that is not our own, and we're headed to our own promised land. So we come to the end of Jacob's journey. It reminds us of two great truths. First, that life is a journey that has many stops. Jacob had gone to Haran to find a wife and had to leave quickly as family tensions arose. He wrestled with God as a Jabbok. He settled but died in Egypt. The life journey has a final destination. We live here as sojourners, but one day we will be taken from this earth to a different place. Next week, we come to the end of our story. And how do you see your life? And that's what I'll examine next week. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you again next week.